Excerpts from Psalm 78. I'll start us in verse 13. He divided the sea and caused them to pass through, and he made the waters stand up like a heap. Then he led them with the cloud by day, and all the night with a light of fire. He split the rocks in the wilderness and gave them abundant drink, like the ocean depths. He brought forth streams also from the rock, and caused waters to run down like rivers. Yet they still continued to sin against him, to rebel against the Most High in the desert. And in their heart, they put God to the test by asking for food according to their desire. And then they spoke against God, and they said, "Can God prepare a table in the wilderness? Behold, he struck a rock, so the water gushed out, and the streams were overflowing. Can he give bread also? Will he provide meat for his people?" Therefore Yahweh heard and was full of wrath, and a fire was kindled against Jacob. And anger also mounted against Israel, because they did not believe in God and did not trust in his covenant. Yet he commanded the clouds above and opened the doors of heaven. He rained down manna upon them to eat and gave them food from heaven. Man did eat the bread of angels. He sent them food in abundance. I'll skip down to the end here. We'll start in verse 65. Then the Lord awoke as if from sleep, like a warrior overcome by wine. He drove his adversaries backwards. He put on them an everlasting reproach. He also rejected the tent of Joseph and did not choose the tribe of Ephraim, but chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loved. And he built his sanctuary like the heights, like the earth, which he has founded forever. He also chose David, his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds. From the care of the ewes with suckling lambs, he brought him to shepherd Jacob, his people, and Israel, his inheritance. So he shepherded them according to the integrity of his heart and guided them with his skillful hands. So there's a lot here to be thankful for and a lot to tremble over as well. The thing that we've seen in the past couple of weeks as we looked at the beginning of Psalm 78 is that it's basically a judgment account of Israel. And so it's long. I mean, it's 72 verses? Yeah, 72 verses. And it's just a recounting of a lot of the most shameful parts of Israel's history from the Old Testament. All kinds of grumbling, all kinds of betrayal, all kinds of rebellion. And then there's this thing that keeps happening in Psalm 78 where the goodness of God is shown despite the rebellion of the people. And so at the beginning of Psalm 78, it says, look, I'm going to utter dark sayings. I'm going to speak in parables. And basically what God is saying is, I'm going to say some stuff that you're only going to get if you're one of my followers. Otherwise, this is going to be total nonsense to you. It'll blow right past you. But if you have ears to hear, listen up. And then it says, tell your kids, tell your grandkids. So Psalm 78 as a whole says, we are faithless. He remains faithful. Now go tell your kids and your grandkids if you understand this message, right? So we take a look at verse 13. We get a couple of, examples of this. It says, he divided up the sea, caused them to pass through. This is the Exodus out of Egypt. Verse 15, he split the rocks in the wilderness. He gave them abundant drink like the ocean depths. So he gives, there's no water in the desert. He makes water come out of a rock. Who is sufficient for these things? God alone. Verse 17, yet they still continued to sin against him, to rebel against the Most High, and in their heart, they put God to the test by asking for food, catch this, according to their desire. Now, this is a far cry from the way that God teaches us to pray, right? In Gethsemane, we see Jesus praying. He says, nevertheless, not my will be done, Father, but your will be done. In the disciples' prayer in Matthew 6, verses 9 through 13, he teaches us to pray by starting saying, our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And then he ends with, for yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory. I guess that's a traditional ending, but it's a good ending to the prayer. There's a reason Christians have been saying that for 2,000 years. And so the way that we are commanded to pray and taught to pray and all of these things is according to God's desire. Right? Now we can pray for the things that we want. I mean, Ephesians 3 is a great example of this. So is Psalm 20. We're asking for things from God, but it's like, the decision is his, and we're all in agreement on that on the front end. That's like the terms of the conversation when we pray. Whatever God says goes. He's the boss. I'm not. I make requests. But they ask for things according to their desire, not to God's desire. God, I want water. Okay, you need some water, right? That's a legitimate request. God gives it to them, and they're like, well, shoot, if it's that easy, let's get some bread up in here. So he gives them some bread because they do need daily bread. And they're like, well, clearly this isn't hard for him, so why can't he give us some meat? What have you done for me lately? And they start getting like arrogant, like the recipients, the beggars, the people that depend on him for their very like daily survival start getting arrogant as if they're owed something. And they start asking for things according to their desires, as if their desires are what dictate God's actions, right? So who's God in that situation? If God is there to serve you, and the point of prayer, I'm speaking not to like you, but to, historical Israel, God's people in general. If the point of prayer is for God to perform and to produce what it is that you request, then you are the ultimate end in that relationship. And God is a means to serve you. You're playing God. And God didn't like that. So he disciplined him. And that's, it says, verse 21, therefore Yahweh heard and was full of wrath. A fire was kindled against Jacob, and anger also mounted against Israel. So he goes through all this stuff about how he rejected some of them, but he still chose some of them. And he rejected some tribes from being the lead and chose Judah as the lead, and, things like that. So the point in all of this is that when we are faithless, he remains faithful, right? He does deal with our sin. He punishes it. Our sin is a cause that has some very serious effects, and those effects last multiple generations. But love covers a multitude of sin. And you can see God's love as this like umbrella that gets brought down even over the rebellion of Israel. And while he doesn't pretend it's not happening, and he deals with it in a very just and detailed, like a thorough, there's the word I'm looking for. He deals with it in a just and a very thorough manner. He still keeps showing love to these people that don't love him back. And so you read through Psalm 78 and you just see the shot after shot of rebellion against God. And yet you see God just, even in his anger, he's giving love. Even in his judgment, he's showing love. And that's what brings us to the end here as you go through this cycle again and again in Psalm 78. He says, verse 65, he awoke from his sleep and he drove his adversaries backwards. So now here's God fighting their battles for them, even when they were rebellious against him. He put their adversaries in an everlasting reproach. He also, now here's the punishment, rejected the tent of Joseph, and he did not choose the tribe of Ephraim. But here's the grace, he did choose the tribe of Judah. So all of Israel was going to be blessed through Judah, which, by the way, is the tribe that Jesus came through. So that's how that story ended. And he built his sanctuary like the heights. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he did not cast off his people whom he foreknew, did he? No, he chose them, blessed them, and structured it in such a way for their good. And as if that wasn't enough, verse 70, he also chose David, his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds. He gave him a king, and a good one. Look at the last verse here, verse 72. So he, David, shepherded them according to the integrity of his heart, and guided them with his skillful hands. So God's grace gets the last word in this story of rebellion, right? God's gift is the last thing mentioned here, not the sin. And that's the way that that's the way that the gospel works, right? By the way, the person that is calling me right now, I know you're actually watching this because you watch these every week. So much love. Sorry to ignore your phone call. The way that the gospel works is that God's grace and God's love gets the last word on this stuff. So again, when we are faithless, he remains faithful. What do we do with all of this? Well, first thing is we need to reckon with the character of God. His absolute faithfulness that is completely undeterred by anything that we do. Even though he doesn't ignore what we do and he deals with it, it doesn't stop him from showing love either. And then the second thing that we do is we tell our kids about it, right? How are they going to know if we don't tell them? How are we going to know what he's done in the past? Now, our kids can be saved by God and he can give them their own stories and their own testimony, and that's all great. That happens. But then their knowledge of God only goes back as far as their own number of years. And that's not very far, right? We don't live to be that old, all things considered. And so we don't know what God has done in the past unless we hear it from the generations that were there. So tell your kids and tell your grandkids about the faithfulness of God. And he says at the beginning, I mean, look, I'm going to utter dark sayings. I'm going to speak in parables. Essentially, he's saying, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. So if you are spiritually alive, if you have been born again, and you are awake to recognize the blessings of God, we have a responsibility to tell future generations about it. So you guys have another week until the next iteration of these Psalms devotions come out. So you've got 1 week now to figure out how you're going to get that done, right? You're going to remember the blessings of God and tell your kids about it, or the next generations about it. You know, make a phone call, something like that. I'll see you guys on the next one, and tell me about those conversations that you have, because I'd love to hear the stories about those multi-generational exchanges of the accounts of God's grace going back and forth. So until next week, go tell the kids.